Welcome to St. John's Gospel. I will be sharing with you for quite some time about this wonderful treasure that we have. The first thing you will notice about St. John's Gospel when you pick it up, whether you're a scholar or a first-time reader, is that it is different from the other three Gospels. And the other three Gospels are called the Synoptic Gospels because they deal generally with similar material. John is completely different to that. John died around 96 AD, that's towards the end of the 1st century. And from the 2nd century onwards, John's Gospel was well known and is quoted by a number of the early church fathers, like Saint Ignatius of Antioch, who lived around 115 AD. He speaks about the Spirit which knows where it comes from and where it's going, which is quoting John chapter 3. He also quoted John 1, 7 and 8, for example. Saint Polycarp and Saint Justin, who lived around that time as well, they also quoted John. Now, one of the questions people ask is, who wrote the Gospel? And so when we're dealing with the authorship, you have to remember that many of the books of the Old Testament who have a name attached to them may not be written by that person. For example, the first 5 books of the Bible come from Moses, but the name Moses isn't actually on any of the texts. So we have a very important text called the Muratori Canon, which was written in Rome around 180 AD. And in this text, you will read these words: "The Gospel of John was communicated and proclaimed to the church by John himself during his own lifetime." Now, he died in 96 AD. So that means that the gospel was proclaimed before that and the gospel was put together before that. And this quotation that is in that book comes from Papias of Hierapolis. And this man was a disciple of John. We also have Saint Irenaeus of Lyon around 130 AD, who knew Polycarp. He said that John, the disciple of the Lord, who had even rested on his breast, he himself published a book, a gospel, while he was living at Ephesus. So we now have an author and we have a place, that it was John and that he was living at Ephesus and was at the end of the 1st century. All of that is very important. We have one more, and that is Eusebius, who wrote the Ecclesiastical History in the 2nd century. He said that John wrote a gospel after the other gospels had been written. So when you come to from the 4th century onwards, there's just the unanimous tradition that the author of the 4th gospel is John the Apostle. So let's come to the gospel itself. And what you find in the gospel itself is that the author keeps himself anonymous. He doesn't tell you who he is, but he describes himself as the disciple that Jesus loved. In John 13:23, you're told that he leaned on the breast of Jesus at the Last Supper. In John 18, verses 15 to 18, we're told that when Jesus was going on trial before the Sanhedrin, that John was known to the high priest and he was able to go in. But that Peter, being a Galilean, couldn't go in, and John was the one who used his influence. I should say that this person, whom we know as John, used his influence to get Peter into the hall. We're told that the beloved disciple in John 19, verses 23 to 26, that he stood at the foot of the cross and that Jesus' mother was given to him for him to take care of her. We're told in chapter 20, verses 2 to 10, that this person ran with Peter to the tomb and that he was the first to believe in the resurrection. In chapter 21, verses 20 to 23, we're told that he was the only one of the disciples who recognized Jesus on the shore when they were coming in from fishing. And in John 21:24, we're told that this beloved disciple is the author of the gospel. I brought in the early church fathers just very briefly because they are the ones who identified this beloved disciple as John, the son of Zebedee, who was martyred in 41 AD. Zebedee was a fisherman in Galilee who did business with the house of Annas in Jerusalem, and he supplied fish to the house of Annas. That's how his son John was recognized, because Zebedee would have sent his sons with the materials to the house. This gospel is one of the greatest treasures, not only in the church, but in the world. It's absolutely incredible. It has been the food and the consolation of all the saints of all time since it was written. Some people call him, the author, John the Divine, simply because he wrote everything from heaven's perspective. So let me put John in the context of the four Gospels. The four Gospels are like looking at the mystery of Christ, looking at light through a prism. If you put light through a prism, the different colors of light will separate. None of the individual colors are the whole of the light. It takes all of those colors together to make the light. And yet each one of those colors of the rainbow are completely authentic. So what you have in the four Gospels is that the mystery of Christ, who is the light of the world, John tells us in chapter 8, verse 12 and chapter 9, verse 5. The evangelists are looking at that mystery from different angles. Now, each one of those angles is correct, but none of them is the complete thing. And so you need the four Gospels together to make a unified testimony as to who Jesus is. And it's very, very interesting. So let me just give you a very brief thought on this. When you come to Matthew's Gospel, which is placed first, and the placement of a Gospel or any text in the Bible is very important for its interpretation. Matthew wrote his testimony to the people of the circumcision, whom we call Jews nowadays, but they weren't called Jews at the time. And he wanted to convince them that Jesus of Nazareth was their Messiah and that he was the fulfillment of the scriptures. So the whole theme of his gospel is, behold your king. Very important. And he quotes the Old Testament more than 41 times to prove it. So then you come to St. Mark's Gospel, the shortest of the four Gospels. And Mark is writing from a Gentile perspective. And he explains some of the Jewish customs because he knows some of his readers won't understand them. And he takes a completely different approach to Christ. He shows Christ as the suffering servant of Isaiah and fulfilling the whole of these prophecies of the suffering servant. And so his gospel is, behold my servant. There's an immense difference between behold your king and behold my servant. Both of them are correct. Then we come to St. Luke's Gospel. And Luke is also writing from a Gentile perspective, but he's writing with the background of the whole Greek culture behind him. And their paradigm was they wanted man full, complete, and glorious. They were really celebrating the human being, and some of their great statues from that time shows the human body in all its glory. So Luke showed them what a human being was really like. And he wrote the gospel, behold the man. It's really fantastic. So he brings out the humanity of Jesus in an absolutely fantastic way. And he tells the whole Greek world, listen, if you want to know what a man looks like, this is it. And so we're told that there's an old tradition which says that when John was already becoming an old man and the last survivor of the 12 apostles, that the leaders of the church approached him and said, look, Matthew was right, but the Gentile world won't really appreciate it an awful lot. And Mark was right, but the unbelieving world doesn't really appreciate being a servant. And Luke was right, sure, Jesus is the man, but somebody needs to tell us he was God. Somebody needs to emphasize the divinity. Will you do it? And the tradition says that John said, I will do it if the whole church will fast and pray. Can you imagine the miracles that would work today if the whole church fasted and prayed? Incredible. And John wrote the most divine of the four Gospels. And the title of his Gospel is Behold Your God. Now, when you put these four mysteries together, you look at this most astonishing thing, that the person who came among us was our King, was the lowly servant of God, was the greatest man that ever lived, and he was God's presence in our midst. And it's putting the four of them together that we begin to touch the enormity of the mystery of who the Christ actually is. And so I just wanted to give you that as the very beginning. When John began to write his gospel, he actually wrote a very simple message. And some of you will say, simple? Yeah. He wrote a very simple, clear message, but it was on such a high platform of spirituality that if you're not walking those high mountains of spirituality, you won't understand. And so it's very clear in John's gospel that there are two levels of reality presented right from the very beginning. And the higher level is the level that John is actually speaking at. And we call this the realm of above, or the level of above. That is everything seen from God's point of view. And then there's the level of below. And that is how things are seen in the eyes of the unbelieving world. And in John's gospel, the unbelieving world is called the cosmos. He doesn't mean planet Earth. He's talking about the unbelieving world. And he says that the way the unbelieving world sees things and the way God sees things are totally opposite. And this is where you're going to get a lot of the dialogue in this gospel. Absolutely fascinating. So John tells us in chapter 20 and verse 31 why he wrote the gospel. He says, these things are recorded so that you, the reader, or you, the person watching this program, that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ. He's not writing this gospel for scholars. He's not telling you to go and get your PhD studying this book. He's not doing that. He's writing it for saints. He says, these things are recorded so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, and in believing this, that you, the reader or the listener, that you may have life through his name. So the whole purpose of this program that I'm doing for you is not that you will just enjoy a bit of television or that you will just simply while away some time watching programs. It is that you will receive the life that the Lord intended you to receive in hearing this message. And so it will be very important for us who are watching this program to pray, to be in contact with the Lord. Because if we're not praying, we're not going to be at the level that we need to be at in order to hear. So I want to now begin going to look at the structure of this gospel and give you a summary of the gospel, because if I don't do that, you'll get lost in some of the messages of the gospel and you'll lose the overall perspective. Now, if I can give you successfully the overall perspective, then you will see each piece as part of the whole. That's very important. So there are two hinge texts in the gospel. Maybe I should start by saying the gospel has two clear parts. The first 12 chapters are called the Book of Signs, and the rest of it is called the Book of Glory. In the Book of Signs, there's a hinge text, and in the Book of Glory, there's a hinge text. And these two texts hang the whole of the gospel. Okay, the first one is John 1:18. No one has ever seen God. It is the only Son who is close to the Father's heart who has made him known. And in the first half, we're going to hear all about that only Son. When we come to the second half of the Gospel, John 13, 35, 23 to 25, we're told the disciple that Jesus loved was reclining next to Jesus. And then Simon Peter signed to him and said, "Ask who he means." And so leaning back on the heart of Jesus, he said, "Who is it, Lord?" Now, this picture is going to be the whole paradigm for the second half of the Gospel. So in the first half of the Gospel, we have the beloved Son leaning on the heart of the Father for all eternity. And in the second half, we have the beloved disciple leaning on the heart of Jesus. It's these two pictures that carry the entire message. Okay. So why does John not tell you, "I am John," in the Gospel? And he merely refers to the beloved disciple. It is because he wants you, the reader or the listener, to realize that you are the beloved disciple, that John is simply a prophetic forecast of all other beloved disciples that were to come and come into this wonderful relationship with Jesus. So the term beloved disciple isn't necessarily an identification of John, the son of Zebedee, but it describes a particular type of relationship that we have with Jesus, our Savior. And if we realize it's a particular type of relationship, well, that will help us. It'll help us to understand the gospel much more. So now I want to give you a summary of the first half of the gospel, and then I will give you a summary of the second half of the gospel so we can see these two pictures clearly. In the first half, we are shown the relationship between Jesus, the beloved Son, and the Father. In the second half, the relationship between the beloved disciple and Jesus. So, the first thing you're told is that Jesus has leaned on the heart of the Father for all eternity. Now, that is speaking about an intimate, personal relationship. And if you have this intimate, personal relationship with somebody, you know that person, and that person knows you. Listen to this. John 10:15. Just as the Father knows me, I know the Father. Now, the verb to know in the Bible is used differently than what you will find in an English dictionary. The verb to know refers to an intimate personal relationship with a person. For example, in the old translations of the Bible, we used to read, Adam knew his wife Eve and therefore she conceived. Well, that's not theoretical. That's an intimate personal relationship. So John 10:38, then you will know for sure that the Father is in me and I am in the Father. So there's the union between the two. And we're going to find that union between the disciples and Jesus afterwards. Finally, he tells us in John 10:29, the Father and I are one. Now, if we just simply look at this statement that the Father and I are one, then you have to realize when I actually bring you into the text that we're dealing with a mystery in which God the Father and God the Son are working together in tandem throughout this entire mystery. And once you have that picture in your mind, you'll read John correctly. The second thing we're told is that Jesus, who is the Word made flesh, had a relationship with the Father in heaven before time began. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Father and I are one. And so you'll hear him down in chapter 10 saying, before Abraham ever was, I am. So he had this relationship from eternity. The third thing is that Jesus says he's never alone. He looks alone. He seems to act alone. He seems to operate his authority alone, but he says, no, I am not alone. The Father is always with me. Listen to this. This is John 8:16. If I judge, my judgment is sound, because I am not alone. The Father is with me. The one who sent me is with me. So they are working in tandem together. In John 5:19, we read, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can only do what he sees the Father doing. So there's that unity between the Father and the Son working together for the redemption of the human race. And if you just take that very simple statement that I've given to you, that the Father and I are one, I ask you, please, when your program is finished, go and look at a crucifix hard and long and keep saying, the Father and I are one. The Father and I are one, and you'll be quite shocked. And I hope there will be consequences from the shock. The Father and I are one. Immediately in chapter 1, John tells us that Jesus is greater than Moses. I'll deal with this subject at another point. But when you go back to Moses, one of the greatest men who ever lived, you hear in Exodus 33:18, but my face you cannot see, for no human being can see me and live. Now, the greatest man who ever lived, God told him, there's no way you can see my face. What are you told here in John? The beloved Son has not only seen the face of God, but he has seen him for eternity. He's been forever at the Father's side. Therefore, you cannot compare Jesus with any other human being, no matter who they are, no matter what religion they've set up. Jesus is unique because he is divine and human. We say it correctly in the Gloria, you alone are the Holy One. You alone are the Lord. You alone are the Most High, Jesus Christ, in the glory of God the Father. We say it correctly. So, if Jesus has been in the bosom of the Father for all eternity, then the consequence of this is that he alone can reveal what the Father is like. And he alone can speak authoritatively in the name of the Father. He alone can reveal God's will for us. And he alone can teach us God's word, because he's the Word incarnate, and he can show us God's works. Listen to these testimonies from John's Gospel. John 14, verse 9. To have seen me is to have seen the Father. John 5:19. I do what I see the Father doing. John 5:30. My aim is not to do my own will, but to do the will of him who sent me. John 5:36. These works that I do, these works of mine, they testify that the Father has sent me. He's doing divine works. John 5:42. I have come in the name of my Father. John 7:16. The teaching is not from myself. It comes from the one who sent me. I'm going to stop here, and I will take this up in our next episode, giving you a summary of what we find in the second half of the Gospel. Thank you for being with us.